Hello everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from, so before you relax, please consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The bustling streets unfolded like a living mosaic, every corner alive with colors, sounds, and the energy of a tourist haven at its peak. Vendors called out their wares, street performers drew small crowds with their tricks, and the aroma of street food lingered in the warm air. I moved through it all, taking in the chaotic harmony of the scene, camera in hand and a list of landmarks in my pocket. The day had started with excitement. I had planned this trip for weeks, eager to explore a destination I'd only seen in guidebooks and online travel blogs. As I wandered through the marketplace, a tapestry of trinkets, spices, and handmade crafts, I felt immersed in the experience. Yet, amidst the hum of activity, a small detail snagged my attention. Someone standing just beyond the edge of the crowd. I noticed them only briefly, a figure in neutral clothing, blending into the background but with their head angled just enough to suggest they were looking at me. By the time I glanced back to confirm, they were gone, swallowed by the sea of people. The moment was so fleeting, so inconsequential, that I dismissed it as nothing. The day stretched on and I moved from one attraction to another, snapping photos, jotting notes, and enjoying the sights. The figure from earlier didn't cross my mind again, at least not then. It wasn't until I reached a quieter part of the city, a cobblestone square lined with small cafes and benches under leafy trees, that I felt it again, that inexplicable awareness of being observed. I glanced up from the map I was studying and caught sight of them again. This time, they were standing on the far side of the square, partially obscured by the shade of a tree. The figure wasn't doing anything, no phone in hand, no book or coffee cup, just standing there, still as a statue. I stared for a moment, trying to make out their features, but the distance and the way they stood in the shadows made it impossible. Then, almost as if they sensed my scrutiny, they turned and walked away. Their movement was unhurried yet deliberate, slipping behind a building and out of sight. I told myself it was nothing. Plenty of people wandered through this area, and it wasn't unusual for someone to pause and take in the scenery. But something about their posture, the way they seemed to fade into the crowd without effort, left an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite scratch. By midday, the figure had appeared twice more, once near a fountain where children were playing, and again outside a museum I had visited. Each time, the same pattern repeated. They stood just within my line of sight, distant but noticeable, before vanishing the moment I turned my attention toward them. The encounters were brief, yet they lingered in my thoughts. I began to notice myself scanning the crowds more frequently, searching for the person even when I wasn't sure I wanted to find them. At one point, I stopped at a street vendor for a bottle of water. As I unscrewed the cap, I glanced over my shoulder and saw them again, standing at the edge of a bustling plaza. This time, they were closer, close enough that I could almost make out their features. But before I could react, a group of tourists passed between us, and when they cleared, the figure was gone. A sense of unease began to creep in. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone who happened to be visiting the same sites as me. It wasn't unusual for tourists to follow similar itineraries, but the way they appeared and disappeared so seamlessly made it hard to believe it was mere coincidence. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, when I saw them again, this time near the entrance to a quiet alley lined with old weathered buildings. Something in me snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped off the main street and headed toward them, my heart pounding in my chest. The narrow alleyway was dimly lit, the sound of the bustling city fading with each step I took. The figure moved further in, not running but keeping just out of reach, as if leading me deeper into the maze of alleys. I quickened my pace, trying to close the distance, but no matter how fast I walked, they remained just out of reach. My breaths came faster, and the sense of being lured into something I didn't understand gnawed at my resolve. Suddenly, I rounded a corner, and they were gone. The alley was empty, the faint hum of the city beyond its walls the only sound. I stood there, chest heaving, scanning every shadow for movement, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no figure, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I turned and walked back to the main street, a weight settling in my stomach. I had tried to confront them, to make sense of it all, but it felt like the distance between us was more than physical. It was as if they existed on the edge of reality, always just beyond my reach. Back in the sanctuary of my hotel room, I tried to make sense of the day's events. The figure's repeated appearances had moved far beyond coincidence. Every encounter felt intentional, as though they were trying to communicate something, or worse, to unsettle me deliberately. I replayed each moment in my mind, piecing together the strange pattern. No matter where I went, they had appeared, always watching, always at a distance. They never spoke, never gestured, never made any attempt to interact beyond their unnerving presence. What unnerved me most was the way they seemed to know exactly when to vanish, slipping into the crowd or around a corner before I could get close enough to confirm they were even real. Each time, it left me questioning my own perception. Was I imagining them? Were they some kind of trick of the light, a mirage created by my overactive mind? I scrolled through the photos I had taken that day, wondering if I had accidentally captured them in one of my shots. But as I swiped through image after image, there was no sign of the figure. Every frame was filled with smiling tourists, vibrant market stalls, and picturesque scenery. It was as if they had left no trace of their presence, existing only in the space between my glances. I tried to sleep that night, but the thought of their silent, evasive movements haunted me. My mind couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me even now, their gaze boring into me from some unseen vantage point. The following morning, I resolved to put the whole thing behind me. I had come here to enjoy myself, not to be consumed by paranoia. Yet, as I stepped outside into the bright morning light, the familiar sensation of being watched returned almost immediately. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to let myself look for them. But the tension built with every step I took. My surroundings felt sharper, every sound amplified, every passerby scrutinized. I couldn't shake the certainty that they were nearby. By midday, my resolve crumbled. As I stood in line for a food stall, I glanced over my shoulder, and there they were, closer than they had ever been. They stood across the street, their figure partially obscured by a lamppost, their face shadowed but unmistakably turned in my direction. This time they didn't disappear immediately. They lingered, their presence heavy and deliberate. My pulse quickened, and for a moment I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or look away. When I finally turned back toward the food stall, I couldn't bring myself to stay. The idea of eating, of pretending everything was normal, felt impossible. I abandoned the line and hurried down the street, trying to lose myself in the crowd. As evening fell, I found myself at the edge of the city, where the streets were quieter and the crowds thinned. I had spent the day avoiding the busiest areas, hoping to escape the figure's relentless gaze. But as I waited for my bus at a near-empty stop, they appeared again. This time, there was no crowd to shield them, no bustling market to obscure their movements. They stood directly across the street, their face shrouded in shadow, but unmistakably fixed on me. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch toward them, distorting their form. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but sit there and endure their silent presence. Yet I couldn't move. After what felt like an eternity, they turned and walked away, their figure disappearing into the darkness. The bus arrived moments later, and I boarded without looking back. When I returned to my hotel room that night, I locked the door and closed all the curtains, determined to shut out the world. Yet, the sense of being watched lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on me. I tried to distract myself with television, music, anything to drown out the silence, but it didn't help. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound felt amplified. I avoided looking out the window, afraid of what I might see. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I collapsed onto the bed. But as I drifted off, a nagging thought clawed at the edges of my mind. I hadn't seen the last of them. The next morning, I left the city without looking back, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and the strange encounters. The night had stretched longer than I expected. After an exhausting evening, I finally decided to head home, craving the comfort of my bed. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional hum of passing cars. I opened my rideshare app and requested a car, relieved when one was matched almost instantly. The car pulled up to the curb, a dark sedan, clean and ordinary. I double-checked the license plate and driver's name before climbing into the back seat. The driver, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, nodded but said nothing as I settled in. The glow of my phone screen illuminated the route as I glanced at the map on the app. It showed a straightforward path to my apartment, one I was familiar with. I leaned back, letting my guard down, trusting the predictability of the ride. At first, everything seemed fine. The car's engine hummed softly, and the occasional streetlights cast fleeting shadows across the interior. I scrolled absent-mindedly through my phone, occasionally glancing at the map to confirm we were on track. The world outside passed in a blur, and for a moment I felt a sense of ease. But then, something shifted. I noticed the car veering off the suggested route. It was subtle at first, taking a right turn instead of continuing straight. My eyes darted to the app, which recalculated the route almost immediately. I assumed it was a shortcut, though it seemed odd since the original path was already the most direct. Minutes passed, and the detours became more frequent. Each turn took us further away from the brightly lit main roads and into quieter, darker streets. The app's path no longer matched the driver's decisions. "Are we taking a different route?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, but didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was dismissive. "Don't worry, I know a faster way." The words did little to reassure me. My grip tightened on my phone as I stared at the map. The app's estimated arrival time kept increasing. I glanced out the window, noticing the absence of familiar landmarks. The buildings were sparse now, and the streetlights grew fewer and farther between. A cold unease crept over me. Something about this wasn't right. As the car continued down unfamiliar roads, the driver broke the silence with a question. "Do you live alone?" he asked, his voice casual but laced with something I couldn't quite place. My stomach tightened. The question felt out of place, invasive. "Why do you ask?" I replied curtly, trying to mask my discomfort. He shrugged, his eyes flicking back to the road. "Just curious. You seem like someone who enjoys their independence." I didn't respond, my mind racing. The conversation shifted from small talk to something more probing. He asked about my evening plans, my work schedule, and if anyone was expecting me at home. Each question felt more personal than the last, his tone growing increasingly unsettling. I glanced out the window again, trying to assess my surroundings. The streets were deserted, the faint glow of distant city lights barely visible. My heart pounded as I realized how isolated we had become. The road ahead was dark, lined with trees and empty lots. My unease was quickly turning into panic. I tried to think of a logical explanation for his behavior. Maybe he was just socially awkward, or perhaps he genuinely thought he was helping by avoiding traffic. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I checked the app again, hoping to see some reassurance in the recalculated route. Instead, it showed us veering farther and farther from my destination. My chest tightened as I realized we were heading in the opposite direction. I considered confronting him, but fear held me back. If his intentions were malicious, how would he react? My phone felt heavy in my hand, and I thought about calling someone, anyone, but the fear of escalating the situation kept me frozen. As the car slowed to take another turn, I made a decision. Pretending to answer an urgent phone call, I raised my voice, feigning an emergency. "What? You're outside already? I'm almost there," I said loudly, trying to sound convincing. "Driver, I need you to stop right now. I'll get out here." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at me through the mirror. For a moment, I thought he would refuse, but then he pulled the car to the side of the road. The tires crunched against gravel as the car came to a stop. My pulse raced as I reached for the door handle, ready to flee. The cold night air hit me as I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling slightly. I didn't care where I was. All I could think about was getting away. The gravel crunched underfoot as I moved quickly to put distance between myself and the car. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, lingering. The road was poorly lit, bordered by trees and a few scattered houses in the distance. My phone still in hand, I pretended to stay on the call, loudly mentioning that someone was meeting me nearby. The driver stayed parked for a moment too long before pulling away, the taillights disappearing into the dark. I exhaled shakily, but the relief was short-lived. Looking around, I realized I was in an unfamiliar part of town. The road stretched out in either direction, empty and silent. My phone still showed the rideshare app, which now displayed a notification asking for feedback on the completed trip. I tapped through the app, desperate to find a way back to safety. The nearest gas station was nearly a mile away, but it was the only place with any semblance of security. Gripping my phone tightly, I started walking briskly, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnervingly in the stillness. Each crunch of gravel and rustle of leaves made me jump, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if he came back? What if someone else was watching me now? The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and the dim glow of the gas station in the distance felt impossibly far. I walked faster, keeping my eyes on the faint light ahead. Every now and then I thought I heard the faint hum of a car engine, but when I turned, the road behind me was empty. When I finally reached the gas station, the relief was overwhelming. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the faint smell of fuel filled the air. The station was mostly empty, save for a lone cashier inside and a single car parked by the pumps. I stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the building wrap around me. The cashier glanced up briefly, but didn't say anything. I lingered near the counter, trying to calm my breathing while pretending to browse the snack racks. I pulled out my phone again, my hands still shaking. I called a friend, explaining what had happened in rushed, clipped sentences. They insisted on coming to get me immediately and urged me to report the incident to the rideshare company. I nodded absently, though the thought of reliving the experience made my stomach churn. When I hung up, I filed a report through the app, detailing the driver's behavior and the deviation from the route. The cashier gave me a curious glance as I lingered near the counter, but I didn't care. The bright lights and the faint murmur of a radio in the background felt like a safety net. I stayed put until my friend arrived, their car pulling up to the front of the station. Sliding into the passenger seat, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. As we drove away, I recounted the story in full, my voice steadying as the distance from the gas station grew. Back at home, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one before retreating to my room. The ride had ended hours ago, but the unease clung to me, refusing to dissipate. I replayed the events in my head, analyzing every detail, every decision I had made. What would have happened if I hadn't pretended to take that call? Where had the driver been planning to take me? Though I was safe now, the questions remained unanswered. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the house and every distant car passing by outside made me tense, my mind still caught in the memory of that ride. I had always dreamed of starting fresh, leaving behind the old routines and the stale air of my previous place. When I moved into the new apartment, everything felt new, crisp, clean, and full of potential. The walls, freshly painted, gave off a faint scent of newness, and the sunlight streamed through the large windows, bathing the space in warmth. The apartment wasn't large, but it was just what I needed. A small living room, a cozy bedroom, and a compact kitchen, all nestled in a quiet part of town. It was perfect for someone like me, who didn't need much but a quiet place to retreat to after the bustle of daily life. The first few days passed with a sense of peace. I spent hours unpacking, arranging my belongings just the way I liked them. The shelves were filled with books, the kitchen organized with dishes, and the bed neatly made with soft white linens. Each corner felt like my own, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at home. But then, on the fourth day, I noticed something strange. A small scratch on the freshly painted wall near the door. At first, I thought it was just a tiny imperfection, something that came with settling in. But it was odd. I hadn't done anything near that wall, and the scratch seemed too deliberate to be accidental. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was probably from moving furniture, or maybe even a small mistake in the painting. But that night, when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off. Over the next few days, the oddities continued. A cabinet door was slightly ajar when I was sure I'd closed it. A chair in the living room was turned just enough to feel wrong, like someone had been sitting in it. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than forgetfulness. After all, I had just moved in. The place was small, and things were bound to shift. But then it happened again. A door I had left completely shut was wide open when I returned from work. This time I couldn't brush it off. My thoughts began to spiral. Was I losing my mind? Could I be forgetting these little details? The feeling of unease settled in deeper. At night, the quiet of the apartment seemed to magnify, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. The apartment had always been quiet, but now it felt almost too quiet, like it was waiting for something. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just adjusting, that the weird things I was noticing were all in my head. But the more it happened, the harder it became to pretend everything was fine. I had to be sure. I needed to know if I was just being paranoid. So one afternoon, I decided to test it. I took a roll of masking tape and sealed one of the drawers in the kitchen, the one where I kept my utensils. It was a simple test. If the tape was broken when I returned, I would know for sure that someone had been inside. That night, before I left for work, I also took a picture of the living room, just the way I had arranged it. The chairs were angled just so, and everything felt in place. I hoped it would be enough to prove my suspicions wrong. When I came home that evening, the apartment felt the same, quiet, calm. But then I walked into the kitchen. The drawer was open and the tape had been peeled back. It was impossible. I had made sure to seal it carefully. I couldn't believe it. My heart raced, my mind spinning with the implications. I checked the living room next. The chair was shifted just slightly to the left. A subtle change, but enough to confirm what I already knew. Someone had been inside. Someone had been moving my things. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the apartment made my skin crawl. The creaking of the old wooden floors, the hum of the refrigerator, even the soft rustle of the curtains in the breeze. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Who was doing this? I couldn't shake the image of the drawer. The tape peeled back just enough to show that it had been tampered with. Someone had entered my home, gone through my things, and left without a trace. The next day, I decided to take it further. I taped more things. This time, the bathroom door, the closet, and even the bedroom window. I photographed every room, taking detailed pictures of everything in place. My plan was simple. I would prove to myself that this wasn't just my imagination. When I returned that evening, the apartment felt different. The air was thicker, heavier. As I moved from room to room, checking the tape and looking at the photos I'd taken, I found what I feared. The bathroom door was ajar. The closet door, which I had carefully left closed, was wide open. And the bedroom window, just slightly unlocked. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, the weight of the realization settling in. Someone had been here, and they were coming back. The following days were a blur of anxiety and dread. I couldn't bring myself to stay in the apartment for long stretches of time. I found myself leaving earlier in the morning, staying late at work, and spending as much time as possible at friends' houses. I needed to be away from the apartment, where I no longer felt safe. But no matter how much I tried to avoid it, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always there, watching, waiting. Every time I returned, the apartment seemed slightly more off. The subtle changes, the movements in the furniture, the faint smells in the air that I couldn't place, they were becoming more frequent, more deliberate. One evening, after staying at a friend's place for a couple of days, I came back to find the front door unlocked. I knew I had locked it before I left. Panic gripped me as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The silence was oppressive, and I could feel the weight of the space pressing down on me. The bathroom light was on. I was sure I had turned it off before leaving. I forced myself to take a deep breath, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I walked into the bathroom, hoping it was just a mistake. But as soon as I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. The sink was wet, the towel slightly disheveled, and the mirror was fogged up as if someone had just used it. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I stood frozen, staring at the condensation on the mirror, as the realization sank in. someone had been in the apartment, and they had been using the bathroom. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept replaying every moment from the past few weeks, every small disturbance, every subtle shift in the apartment. It was all too much. My mind couldn't make sense of it, and the fear twisted inside me like a knot. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I stayed in the apartment, determined to catch whoever was responsible. I locked every door, checked every window, and sat in the dark, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed. I hadn't heard a sound. Maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then, just as I was starting to convince myself that I was being paranoid, I heard it. A soft shuffle, like footsteps on the floorboards. My heart stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. I didn't dare move. I waited, my body tense, my ears straining for the slightest noise. The footsteps stopped. The apartment was silent again. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared move. I crept down the hallway, every floorboard creaking beneath my feet. I reached the living room, but there was no one there. Nothing had been disturbed. But then I saw it. A chair in the corner, facing the wall. It had been moved. It wasn't where I had left it. And as I stared at it, the realization hit me like a cold wave. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been here. The terror that gripped me that night was unlike anything I had ever felt. I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't sleep in that apartment, knowing that someone had been inside, someone who had watched me, who had invaded my space without a trace. I packed quickly, throwing clothes and belongings into a suitcase with shaking hands. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't risk it. The apartment, once so full of promise, now felt like a prison, a place of darkness and fear. The thought of staying another night made my stomach turn. I grabbed my things and left without a second thought, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. It was a typical Tuesday when I found the letter. I wasn't expecting anything, and that's probably why it stood out. It wasn't in an envelope, just a single sheet of paper folded neatly, with no return address. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, and unfamiliar. I glanced around my porch before bringing it inside, as if somehow expecting someone to be waiting. But there was nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a mistake, some sort of random delivery. I unfolded the paper, the edges slightly creased, and began reading. The letter started simply, "I've been watching you." I laughed at the absurdity of it, a prank, I assumed. But as I read further, the words didn't match the usual nonsense people send for fun. The letter described places I had recently visited, an old bookstore, a cafe I frequented, even a small park where I liked to walk. It mentioned a brief interaction I had with a friend last week, one that seemed entirely mundane at the time, but now it felt different. The writer knew specifics I hadn't shared with anyone, things no one else would have known. I set the letter down for a moment, a slight chill creeping down my spine. It didn't seem real. I looked at the letter again, more carefully this time. The paper was simple, no fancy stationery, just plain white. The handwriting was sharp but elegant, neat but hurried, like it was written in a rush. There were no big threats or menacing phrases, just those unsettling details. And the last line, "The danger is closer than you think." I put the letter down, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that settled in my stomach. It could be a joke, I thought, or maybe some bizarre marketing scheme. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the specifics. The letter mentioned my recent trip to the park, an odd coincidence maybe. But then I realized it mentioned something even more personal. A conversation I had with a friend about a private matter. Something no one else knew. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was nothing, a random weird event. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the thought. Who would do something like this? And why? The letter didn't make sense. It was too precise, too specific. I decided I'd throw it away in the morning, but as I sat up to place it on the desk, the feeling of being watched returned. I couldn't explain it. It was as if someone had been standing just behind me the entire time. The next day, I woke up feeling off. The letter lingered in my mind, and I kept replaying the details. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how specific the writer's words were. It wasn't just vague observations or guesswork. It was like they knew things about me, things no one could possibly know. I went about my morning routine, but the creeping sense of unease followed me. At work, I couldn't focus, my mind constantly returning to the letter. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone staring at me from the other side. I tried to push it aside, but each time I picked up the letter and reread it, the details jumped out at me. You sat on the bench near the fountain last Thursday morning, just before the rain started. You spoke to a woman in the coffee shop about your plans for the weekend. I had sat on that bench, and I had spoken to Sarah, a colleague, about my weekend plans. No one else had been around. There was no way the writer could have known that unless they were there. I began to wonder how much they knew. How long had they been watching me? And who could it possibly be? The thought of someone following me, taking note of my every move, started to gnaw at me. It wasn't just an invasion of privacy, it was a violation of my very existence. The letter didn't mention anything threatening, but the more I read, the more it felt like a warning that someone had been watching me and that something was about to happen. But who was it, and why? I felt the need to act, to do something, but I didn't know what. I tossed the letter onto the table, deciding it was best to ignore it. If it was a prank, it wasn't worth my time. But in the back of my mind, something told me it wasn't. The writer had described things in such detail that it felt too personal to be a coincidence. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the letter was more than just a prank. The warning had been subtle, but I couldn't dismiss it. The danger is closer than you think. It had stayed with me, lingering in my thoughts like an echo. I couldn't help but wonder what it meant. Who was the danger? And what did they mean by closer? I spent the following days trying to go about my normal routine, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every sound felt amplified. The rustling of leaves outside my window sounded too loud, the ticking of the clock too distinct. I couldn't escape the sense that someone was watching me, waiting. I didn't know what to do. Should I tell someone? Report the letter to the police? But what could I even say? I received a letter with private information about me, and it says there's danger coming, but I don't know who sent it. They'd laugh me off, or worse, think I was imagining things. But the letter hadn't been a product of my imagination. It had been real. The details were too precise, and I couldn't stop thinking about the threat. It was like a ticking clock in the back of my mind, counting down to something I couldn't see. That's when I started to pay attention to everything around me. I looked at people differently, wondering if they knew more about me than they should. Every face seemed unfamiliar, yet familiar at the same time. I couldn't help but feel that one of them might be the person who sent the letter, or worse, someone who had been following me for weeks. Despite the growing sense of dread, nothing happened. Life went on. Days passed. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that I was just paranoid. But there was no denying the fact that the letter had shaken me, and the fear that something was about to happen lingered, always just out of reach, like a shadow following me wherever I went. Unable to shake the fear, I started retracing my steps. I needed to know who could have possibly known so much about me. I thought back to every place I had been, every person I had spoken to, trying to find a link, any link, that could explain the letter. I visited the coffee shop again, looking around for anything unusual, anyone who might have noticed me. The barista greeted me like usual, and the woman I had spoken to last week wasn't there. I felt ridiculous. Why was I acting like this? I tried to tell myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But then I thought about the park. The letter had mentioned it too. I couldn't remember anyone who had been around when I visited, but I hadn't been paying close attention either. Maybe I'd missed something. So I went back to the bench near the fountain, the exact spot described in the letter, and sat there for a while, watching people walk by. Nothing stood out. No one seemed to notice me. I couldn't find any answers. I felt more helpless than ever. My mind was running in circles, convinced that the letter meant something, that I had missed some vital detail. The more I thought about it, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on me. I had no idea who might be behind it, and no idea how to stop it. The sense of being watched only grew stronger with each passing day. It was like someone was always just outside my line of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. After a while, life began to feel like it was returning to normal. The letter and the strange details it contained faded into the background of my mind, and I tried to convince myself that it had just been a strange, unsettling incident, a one-off occurrence that I could forget. The office was eerily still. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the soft tapping of keys on keyboards, and the occasional sound of someone shifting in their seat were the only sounds that broke the silence. It was an overnight shift, one of those shifts that felt like they could stretch on for hours, where time seemed to slow and the office took on a lifeless quality. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen. The work was simple: data entry, sorting through files, but the silence of the building made every task feel like it carried more weight. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, as if mocking the slow passage of time. The office was small, not many people worked at this hour, and the air felt thick with stillness. Across the room, my coworker Matt sat at his desk. At first, I didn't think much of it. He had always been a little quieter than the others, but tonight there was something off. It wasn't glaring, but it was noticeable. He kept glancing at the clock, shifting in his seat as though he was trying to get comfortable but couldn't. Every so often his fingers would twitch like he was fighting the urge to do something. I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was just tired, like I was. We'd both been working through the night, and fatigue had a way of making you more aware of the little things. The silence between us grew. I tried to focus on my work, but every so often I would glance at Matt. His eyes would dart around the room, scanning the corners like he was expecting someone to appear. His leg bounced up and down nervously. Then I caught it, a faint muttering. It wasn't a conversation, just random words. I couldn't make them out, but I was certain they weren't directed at me. I tried to focus again, telling myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Something had shifted. Something felt wrong, and I couldn't pinpoint what it was. As the night wore on, the oddness of Matt's behavior grew harder to ignore. At first, I chalked it up to nerves or stress. Maybe he had an important project or something weighing on his mind. But the way he looked over his shoulder every few seconds, that wasn't normal. The room was quiet, save for the tapping of our keyboards, but Matt's eyes were scanning the room as if he were hearing something I couldn't. I looked up from my screen, wondering if maybe I'd missed something, some sign of what was bothering him. But there was nothing. His fidgeting became more pronounced. His hands, usually steady when working, now twitched at the sides of his desk, his fingers tapping on the wood in an erratic rhythm. Every few minutes, he would glance quickly at the clock, then back at his computer, but his focus seemed to shift at nothing. At one point, he even stood up, walked to the window, stared out at the empty parking lot for a while, then sat back down. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. Maybe he was just a little off tonight. People weren't always themselves when they were working the night shift. But the longer it went on, the more unsettling it became. His eyes, wide and darting, made me nervous. He hadn't spoken a word to me, not really, just those faint mutterings. I couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his mind. Was he on edge for some reason I didn't know? I tried to focus on my own work again, but the tension in the room was thick. Every time I looked over, Matt seemed to be more agitated, as though he was struggling to control something inside of himself, something dangerous. Matt's behavior became even more erratic as the night went on. At this point, I was certain something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. The soft mutterings under his breath turned into fragments of sentences, disjointed words that made no sense. Every now and then, I would hear him say something like, "It's too late now," or "They're here." I glanced over at him, trying to make sense of what was happening. He was staring at the screen in front of him, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. His eyes, wide and unfocused, kept darting from side to side, his breath shallow. "What's going on, Matt?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I couldn't hide the concern in my voice. He didn't respond. His gaze was locked on the hallway outside the office door. His eyes were wild, unblinking. I could see the tension in his shoulders, like he was ready to bolt at any moment. I felt the air in the room grow heavier, thick with the kind of tension I had never felt before. Every noise made Matt flinch, every click of my mouse, every tap of the keyboard. His shoulders twitched at the sound of the HVAC system kicking on live, as if the noise itself was something that could hurt him. The whole room felt charged, like a live wire ready to snap. "Matt, are you all right?" I asked again, my voice quieter this time, almost afraid to break the strange quiet that had settled over us. His response wasn't what I expected. His eyes snapped toward me, wide with panic, and he muttered, "Stay out of it." The words were sharp, almost too sharp, and I felt my heart race. The room seemed to grow colder as he said it. The tension escalated with every second that passed. I didn't know what to say. The words seemed strange, cryptic, like a warning. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. He wasn't just acting anxious anymore. He was scared, terrified. The room fell into an unnatural silence after Matt spoke. The kind of silence that settles into your bones, making every breath you take feel too loud. I watched as he stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back with a harsh scrape across the floor. Without another word, he walked toward the door, his footsteps quick, deliberate. His gaze never left the hallway, and he moved with a strange urgency. I stood frozen at my desk, unsure of what to do. He reached for the door handle, but just before leaving, he paused. "Don't follow me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge me again. And then, just like that, he disappeared into the darkened hallway, leaving me alone in the office. I stared at the door for what felt like hours, the silence hanging heavy in the air. My heart was pounding in my chest. I tried to process what had just happened, but the more I thought about it, the less I understood. What was he running from? Why had he said those things? I sat there, alone and unsettled, the office now feeling like a much darker place than it had before. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier, and most of all, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous had just walked out of the room with him. What secret was Matt hiding? What had he seen or known that had driven him to act this way? And now, with him gone, was I safe? Or had I just stepped into something far worse? I was left sitting there, the hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly too loud, the constant ticking of the clock piercing through the heavy silence. My mind raced. I couldn't focus on the work I had left to do. My thoughts kept returning to Matt, the way he had looked at me when he left, that wild, frantic look in his eyes. The office felt different now. I could hear the soft creaks of the building settling, the distant hum of machines from other departments. But the quiet was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive. Every sound seemed amplified, like it was coming from a place far too close to me. I tried to shake off the sense of unease, telling myself it was just the tension of the night shift getting to me. Maybe Matt was having a personal crisis, or maybe he had snapped from the stress. People had been known to crack under pressure, but none of that explained the cryptic words he'd said before he left. What had he meant by "stay out of it"? And why did he seem so terrified? The longer I sat there, the more I felt the weight of the situation. I was alone. No one else was in the office. The building felt empty, but not in the way I had come to expect. It felt hollow, as if something was waiting for me to notice it. I stood up, my chair scraping across the floor. I needed to move, to do something to break the strange tension that had settled in. I walked down the hallway, feeling my footsteps too loud in the emptiness. The lights overhead flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I glanced down each hallway I passed, half expecting to see Matt standing there, staring back at me. But there was nothing. The building was still. I arrived at work that morning like any other, the early sunlight filtering through the office windows, casting long shadows on the cold, sterile walls. The air was cool, the quiet before the rush of another workday settled in. I walked into my office, my eyes scanning the usual clutter on my desk. But something was different today. There, sitting in the middle of the desk, was a box. It wasn't large, about the size of a shoebox, and it was addressed to me. There was no return address, no postage stamps, nothing that would give any indication of where it came from. My name was written in neat, almost too perfect handwriting. My curiosity was piqued. I ran my fingers over the rough surface of the cardboard. the weight of the box strange and solid. There was no telling what was inside, but I had a feeling that whatever it wasn't just a random package. It felt intentional, like it had a purpose. My thoughts raced. Who could be sending me something like this? Was it a mistake, or had someone intended to send it to me specifically? I hesitated for a moment, but then my curiosity won out. I grabbed a letter opener from my desk drawer, carefully slicing through the tape. My hands trembled slightly, as though the box was holding a secret that I wasn't prepared for. As the cardboard flaps opened, I peered inside. The first thing I saw was a blood-stained shirt, the dark red splotches stark against the white fabric. It was old, the kind of shirt that looked worn from years of use, but the stains were fresh, the kind that would never wash out. My stomach churned. Next, there was a photograph. I lifted it slowly, my eyes scanning the scene. It was a picture of a man, someone I recognized, but something about it felt off. The background was unfamiliar, and the man's face was frozen in a look of terror. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that it was someone close to me, someone I trusted. And then, the note. I unfolded it, and my eyes quickly scanned the words, the handwriting messy, almost frantic. It was short, cryptic, but the message was clear. You're part of this now. You can't escape it. I sat frozen for a long moment, the box still open before me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Who had sent this? Why me? What did it all mean? I couldn't shake the feeling that the package wasn't just a coincidence. It was personal. The shirt, the photograph, the note, they were all tied to something I couldn't yet understand. But I knew I had to find out. I stared at the items in front of me, the blood-stained shirt still lying in the box, its dark stains smeared in a way that looked too deliberate. I ran my fingers over the fabric, feeling the cold, grim texture, but it only made my unease grow. What kind of person would send something like this? What was their intention? I turned my attention to the photograph. The man in it was someone I recognized, a friend from years ago, someone who had been a part of my life for a long time. His name was David. We had gone to college together, shared a lot of memories, good memories. But the man in the photo wasn't the David I knew. His face was twisted in fear, his eyes wide and desperate. He was standing in what looked like a dark alleyway, the surroundings blurred and hard to make out. But it wasn't just his expression that bothered me. It was the sense of danger that seemed to radiate from the photo, as though something terrible was lurking just beyond the frame. I turned the photo over. On the back, in the same messy handwriting as the note, was a single phrase, "He knows too much." My stomach dropped. David knew something? What could he possibly know that was so dangerous? The note in the box offered no more clarity. It was short, but the words seemed to hang in the air, each one more chilling than the last. I read it over and over, trying to understand the meaning behind the cryptic sentences. You're part of this now. What did that even mean? Part of what? And what was I supposed to do with this knowledge? I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a prank, some sick joke from someone I knew. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was a feeling gnawing at me, a realization that I was being drawn into something much darker than I had anticipated. The more I thought about the photograph, the more I felt like I was missing something crucial. David had been a good friend. We hadn't kept in touch much in recent years, but I knew him well. This didn't make sense. What had happened to him? Why was his image so distorted in the photo? I thought back to the last time I saw him. It had been a few months ago, at a mutual friend's wedding. Nothing seemed off then. But what if it had been? What if there had been something dark hiding beneath the surface that I hadn't seen? The note's words echoed in my mind. You're part of this now. What was I a part of? I couldn't shake the feeling that the package had been sent to me for a reason, that I was somehow connected to this larger mystery. It felt like a puzzle I couldn't put together, a mystery with no clear starting point. I looked at the photograph again, trying to make sense of it. The alleyway looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. Maybe if I went to that spot, I could figure out what had happened to David. Maybe it was the only way to understand what was going on. I couldn't just sit there. I had to find out what was happening. But the more I tried to convince myself to act, the more I felt paralyzed. I didn't know where to start. Everything I did only seemed to lead me further into confusion, like I was chasing shadows. I knew I had to keep digging. But what if digging deeper only uncovered more darkness? What if I was already too far gone? I couldn't stop thinking about David. The more I tried to shake the image of him from my mind, the more it haunted me. The fear in his eyes, the cryptic message on the back of the photo, he knows too much. What was it that he knew? And how was I connected to it all? I started by retracing his steps, trying to remember the last time I saw him, the last conversation we had. It had been at the wedding, but I didn't remember anything unusual about that day. We had talked about work, life, mundane things. Nothing that hinted at anything dark. But what if I was missing something? What if there had been something in his life that I hadn't known about? I tried calling our mutual friends, hoping they might know something. But none of them had heard from David in weeks, and when I mentioned the package, they seemed just as confused as I was. No one knew anything. I turned to social media, searching through old posts, anything that might give me a clue. That's when I found it, a post from a few months ago, just after the wedding. David had shared a cryptic message about secrets that need to stay buried. My heart pounded as I read the words again. Had he been warning us? Was he trying to tell us something, but we didn't listen? I dug deeper, looking into his past, his family, anything that could explain why someone would send me this box, this message. But the more I searched, the more questions I had. There were no clear answers, just more fragments that didn't fit together. It was as if someone had planned this all along, leaving me clues, pushing me towards something I couldn't yet understand. Every step I took only led to more confusion, more fear. The closer I got to the truth, the more I felt like I was being pulled into something that was bigger than me. As the days went by, the weight of the package and its contents grew heavier. Every time I walked into my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I would glance over my shoulder, convinced that someone was standing just out of sight. At night, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, and the silence was deafening. I tried to push these thoughts aside. Maybe I was just stressed, maybe the unsettling nature of the package had messed with my mind. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was as if something was lurking just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I started noticing things, small things at first. A car parked outside my building for hours, its engine running, its driver's face obscured by the tinted windows. A figure standing too still in the distance, always just outside my line of sight. Each time I saw these things, I would try to dismiss them as coincidence. But the more I tried to ignore them, the more I couldn't. At home, I would leave the door unlocked, only to find it closed when I returned. My mail, which I was certain I had left untouched, would be moved around, and items on my desk were always in a slightly different position. I even started checking my windows and doors before bed, something I had never done before. But no matter what I did, the sense of being watched never faded. It was always there, creeping just below the surface. And then there were the dreams. Dark, twisted dreams that blurred the lines between waking and sleeping. I would dream of David, his face twisted in terror, calling out for help, but I couldn't reach him. I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the nightmare wasn't just a dream. It felt like a warning, like something was trying to reach me through the haze of sleep. The fear consumed me. I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. Was it all in my head? Or was someone really out there, pulling strings, watching my every move? I couldn't tell anymore. The days passed, and the feeling of danger diminished, and with the passage of time, everything returned to normal. It was well past midnight when I heard the knock. I had been sitting in the quiet of my apartment, the only sound being the soft hum of my refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old building settling. The night was calm, almost unnaturally so, and I had been trying to unwind after a long week at work. I wasn't expecting anyone. My friends knew not to disturb me at this hour, and there was nothing on my calendar. Yet, there it was again, the knock. At first, I hesitated. It wasn't like me to open the door to strangers, especially so late. But something about it, something in the way the knock echoed in the silence, made me feel like I had no choice but to answer. When I opened the door, I was met with a disheveled man standing in the doorway, panting heavily, his clothes torn and dirtied. He looked out of place, frantic and wild-eyed, as though he had been running for miles. "Please, I need help," he said, his voice shaky. I've been in an accident. Someone's after me." His words tumbled out in a rush. I could barely make sense of them. His eyes darted around the hallway, as though expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. Despite the late hour, I could feel the panic in his voice, and I hesitated. Should I trust him? Could I trust him? "I don't know where else to go," he continued, his voice rising. "Please, let me in. I can't stay out here. They'll find me." I wasn't sure why, but something inside me moved. Maybe it was the desperation in his voice, or maybe it was simply the impulse to help someone in need. I stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "You're safe here," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though I didn't fully believe it myself. He stumbled inside, his eyes still darting nervously around the room. I locked the door behind him, my stomach twisting as I did. Something didn't feel right, but it was too late now. Once inside, the man seemed to settle a bit, though his body was still wound tight. He moved in jerky motions, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds as if expecting someone to be right behind him. He paced back and forth across the living room, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He nodded quickly, but didn't answer. Instead, he started talking in fragmented sentences, as if he were trying to explain something but couldn't find the right words. His eyes kept shifting, never resting in one place for too long. "They're following me. They know where I am. I can't go back. Please tell me you haven't seen anyone," he pleaded, his voice growing more frantic with each passing second. I tried to reassure him, offering him a seat, but he wouldn't sit still. His foot tapped nervously on the floor, and his hands fidgeted with the cuffs of his torn shirt. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since entering. His gaze was intense, searching, as if he was trying to gauge my reaction. "I don't know who they are, but they'll come for me. They'll come for both of us," he said cryptically. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know what he was talking about. "Who? Who's coming for us?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he just kept pacing, his eyes flicking nervously to the door. There was a sudden shift in the air. His demeanor changed. The frantic energy that had filled the room with tension seemed to deflate, and he became unnervingly calm. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes dark. "You don't understand, do you?" he asked, his voice now low, almost a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to be here, but now that I am, you can't let me leave." I froze, unsure of how to react. Something had changed. I no longer felt like I was helping someone in need. I felt like I was part of something dangerous. I watched as the man's expression shifted again, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. A nervous chuckle escaped him, but it sounded wrong, forced, hollow, like a laugh someone gives when they know something you don't. He turned to me, his smile widening slightly. "It's funny, isn't it? How easy it is to trust someone when you're desperate." He took a slow step forward, and my pulse quickened. "You said you were being followed, that you were in danger," I said, trying to steer the conversation back to something that made sense. "Where's the car? What happened to the accident?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder again, then back at me, his eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling light. "I don't need your help anymore. I'm fine," he said softly, his tone now too calm. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. I didn't know why, but I started to feel like I was being cornered. My body stiffened, and I felt my heart rate pick up. There was something off about him, something I hadn't noticed before. The way his eyes wouldn't stop moving, the way his body seemed to vibrate with tension. I didn't trust him. Then, in one swift motion, he turned and locked the door. I felt my stomach drop. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled again, but it was colder this time. "You've already let me in," he said, his voice smooth as if everything was perfectly normal. "Now you can't let me leave." I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. He was closing in. The door was locked, and the window was too high to escape through. Panic surged within me. The man's eyes never left me. There was no fear, no panic, only a calm, chilling determination. He was in control now, and I realized far too late that I had made a mistake. I had let him in, and now I was trapped. "You were just a pawn in the game," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Just a step in the plan." I searched frantically for something, anything, to defend myself with, but there was nothing within reach. His every movement was calculated, and it felt like he was enjoying my fear. I realized that the whole situation had been a setup from the start, that the emergency had been a lie. I had been lured into a trap. Before I could make a move, he lunged forward, his hands grabbing me by the arms, his grip tight and unyielding. My heart raced in my chest, panic clouding my mind. I fought back, struggling to break free, but his hold was too strong. With one final, desperate push, I managed to twist free and ran toward the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, but I finally wrenched it open. I dashed outside into the cold night, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I looked back at the apartment building. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, my mind reeling with what had just happened. I had let a stranger into my home, a stranger who had been playing me from the start. I stood there, in the middle of the street, trembling. The danger wasn't over, I knew that now. The man I had let in was part of something far worse than I had ever imagined. I couldn't stop shaking as I ran through the streets, my mind racing. I had barely escaped whatever twisted plan that man had for me. My heart was still pounding in my chest, the adrenaline keeping my legs moving even though I felt like I couldn't breathe. I had left everything behind, my apartment, my safety, everything familiar. I stopped at a park bench, my hands gripping the metal frame to steady myself. The night air was cold against my skin, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside me. I looked around, half expecting to see the man lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the streets, the quiet hum of distant traffic. I thought I had escaped, but even as I sat there, my mind kept racing through every moment of the encounter. The way he locked the door, the way he had smiled at me like he was savoring my fear. I couldn't understand it. What had he wanted from me? But that wasn't the scariest part. No, the worst part was the realization that I didn't know who he was. He hadn't said his name. He hadn't given any clues about who he was working for, or why he'd picked me. All I had was his face, but that wasn't enough to track him down. As I stood up to leave, my phone buzzed. I froze, my fingers hesitating above the screen. Who could be contacting me now? I hadn't told anyone about what happened. It couldn't be a coincidence. I checked the screen. There was a single message from an unknown number. "You can't hide forever. We'll find you." A chill ran down my spine. The fear I had tried to suppress came flooding back. My hands shook as I dropped the phone, the screen crackling to life with an ominous notification. The following days were a blur. I couldn't bring myself to go back to my apartment. Instead, I stayed with a friend, lying low, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed. That man's words echoed in my head. "You can't hide forever." After a few days, I went back to my apartment, but I was always on the lookout for any warning signs.